Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Education Beyond Schools panel. I am Taku Machirori, the head of partnerships for the Oxford Africa Business Alliance, and I am a current MBA student here at Oxford Said Business School. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa is sitting on the cusp of unlocking a demographic dividend, and here are some reasons why. As of today, the African continent has an average age of 19 years of age. And it's predicted that by the year 2035, Africa will be home to the world's largest working age population, surpassing China and India. Furthermore, by the year 2050, Africa is going to be home to 1 billion young people. Isn't that just exciting? To give a little bit of context of the aims of our panel today, we're going to have threefold aims. The first is we're going to look at the effectiveness of the existing education models in Africa. The second is we're going to assess some of the interesting innovations in the education space on the African continent. And then lastly, some of the opportunities so that we can really ensure that Africa unlocks this huge dividend that it has in its human power and potential with young people. Before we get started, I am going to introduce our esteemed panelists who I am absolutely honored to have here with us today. First and foremost, we have the Honorable Dr. David Sengeh. Dr. David Sengeh is the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and also the Chief Innovation Officer for the government of Sierra Leone. Furthermore, he co-founded in 2007 Innovate Salon, which is a program through Global Minimum and has supported the innovation and entrepreneurial journeys of thousands of Sierra Leoneans. Outside of that, he's the 2013 Forbes 30 Under 30 awardee, a Senior TED Fellow, a National Geographic Emerging Explorer, an Obama Foundation leader, and most recently, a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. Next, we have Matina Razafimahefa. And Matina is the CEO of Sayna, the first Franco-African edtech and crowdsourcing platform, linking organized IT projects divided into micro tasks to a community of pre-trained developers. Sayna's ambition is to enable millions of Africans, regardless of their situation, to have access to quality digital education and job opportunities around the world. She has also won an award for the best social entrepreneur at the age of 20. And last but not least is Mr. Chinezi Chijioke. Chinezi Chijioke is a co-founder and chief executive officer of Nova Pioneer Education Group, a Pan-African independent private school network that builds and operates world-class, affordable education for students from preschool through to secondary school education using the Cambridge curriculum. Nova Pioneer operates 9 schools in South Africa and Kenya with a goal of operating 100 great schools over the next decade. Chinezi was previously the head of McKinsey & Company's African education practice, where he worked for 8 years with over 25 country school systems across the world. He is a fellow of the 10th class of the African Leadership Initiative, a member of the Aspen Global Leadership Network. So before we get started, I'm going to just say good afternoon to you all panelists. It's an honor. Wonderful. All right, so let's really get into sort of the meat and potatoes of the conversation today. We mentioned sort of the growth that Africa is experiencing with this huge potential of young people. The average age today is 19. And I'd really like to get a perspective from the entire panel around how the African education industry has actually changed in the last 5 years and what you actually predict will happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So maybe we can start with you, Honorable Minister, and then we can go to Chinezi and then Matina to answer that question.
Thank you. It's an interesting question. Yesterday I had a random message from an unknown number, and the person, and I get these all the time, but I don't read many of them. But then I read this one, and it was somebody who's a principal at a senior secondary school in the rural areas. And he was just telling me thank you because, he had been part of the Youth Innovation Program, the Innovate Salon program in 2012. And so back in 2012, we're working with these young people and having them be entrepreneurs, to think about problems in the community, to be engaged. And we're doing it not with any intention beyond that people have to be civically minded and they have to be doing hands-on learning and critical thinking. And this is where the world was going. And 10 years later, a Minister of Education, this person is a principal at the senior secondary school, and his school is actually doing very well, one of the best performing schools in the national exams. And there's no way I would have predicted in 2012 that, the education that we were doing, the hands-on skills development and the programs, entrepreneurship program, was going to create a minister and a principal who was then working with people to do very well. But I would have predicted that engaging in those hands-on learning and problem solving will have these kids be more civically minded. And I also learned that, the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Youth and UNICEF have this generation equality that project that they're doing with about youth entrepreneurs. And I think about 60% of the people who had applied and won freely were all alumni from this youth innovation program many years ago. And this is true when we see the 20-something-year-olds, 24, 25-year-olds in Kenya as well, where we had Innovate Kenya. Many of them had gone through programs back then. I do think it still hasn't changed. And for us in Sierra Leone, one of the things we've just done is we've changed our curriculum. For the first time in like 30 years, we have a new basic education curriculum, a new senior secondary education curriculum, a new ECD early childhood education curriculum, a new civic education curriculum, and we're also working on our adult education curriculum. And one of the things that I tell them is I call 5 C's. Computational thinking, so it's not just math and numeracy. We need to expand numeracy to computational thinking. You can do math for solving some problem. Comprehension, not just literacy. You can read, but you should comprehend. Critical thinking, you can ask the right questions. You're able to imagine. Creativity, you have to think outside the box to solve those problems. And civics, those problems have to matter. The solutions have to matter to citizenship. So I do think that is what we need to do a lot more of in terms of our education system now and into the future.
Thank you so much, Honorable Minister. And over to you, Chinezi, to get your thoughts.
Thanks, Taku, and it's great to join this session. So thanks for the invitation to be part of it. You asked about the industry, so I'll speak maybe a little bit more around the private and nonprofit sector than around sort of the public themes. I guess the past 5 to 10 years there's been an external context that's been quite, that's influenced. Obviously, the past 2 years in particular of COVID has been an unexpected shift in that. So I'd say over the past first 5 years of that period, what we saw, I think, was what I observed was a real shift in the diversity and maybe professionalism of and interest of particularly folks of new providers on the private, whether it's for-profit, non-profit ed across Africa. I think there's just more folks interested, more folks, new models, new forms, for-profit and non-for-profit, and a much wider set of financiers interested in financing that. So whether it's social impact investors or private equity investors, education and health and other social infrastructure has become a pretty big theme across Africa. I'd say, and those are sort of maybe 2 parts. And then from a family's perspective, I think there's a much, over the past 10 or so years, much greater openness to the idea that different formats of learning may be interesting to me. I think, that it's been for a long time, parents have valued, put a very high value in education and education to opportunity for kids. But I think more a sense that I'm open to different providers beyond the schools that I've been traditionally aware of, beyond sort of the traditional, often Christian or religious schools or the public schools. And so you had this 3 sources of innovation, more different variability. And then I think past 2 or 3 years, you've seen some shifts across each of those. So particularly with COVID, I think you've seen some contraction. Some folks realize, wow, this could be tough to provide, and whatever kind of provider I am, some people have to close in certain countries. The shock has sort of filtered that a little bit. You've seen DFIs say we're not going to invest in K-12 across Africa. So you've seen money that should be invested in the space pull out, and with very few exceptions, DFIs. Surprisingly to me, and I have a real critique about that, pulling out of funding private ed and be it profit or not for profit in Africa. And then I think families actually not the desire is still there, but financial strain is showing up in part because of COVID, and so the ability to access this will become more of an issue. What are we seeing now? I think COVID has also forced innovation. So in addition to sort of filtering out, you've also now got more forms, folks trying different approaches to providing services, supports, wraparounds. There's a sort of filtering of those who have tried over the past 10 years, and then a new burst of innovation as folks are problem solving for new environments. And where we are now, I think, currently is really interesting. I think you will see, if you look over the next 5 years, I think you'll see the emergence of a few real African leaders and champions. I think our providers, school groups that have toiled over the past 10 years to, you mentioned 9 schools, and now at 14 schools. Maybe we'll be one of those. There are a few others who will go to a scale of 50 to 100. You will see others who are, I think, there's a group I'm on board of called Imagine Worldwide, which is doing really interesting and effective, scalable work at low cost, basic learning for children in really low resource environments. I think you'll see some really interesting leaders across different aspects of ed in Africa emerge. And then you'll, of course, see a lot more innovation. Some of those will work and some won't work. I hope you'll see capital proven right. I think over the past 5 years, too much investment capital has struggled. And so that's why you see some of the DFIs back off, because some of the investments haven't panned out. But I think going forward, hopefully you'll see some of those investments pan out. So you have public funding supplemented with more private funding in the space. So exciting time ahead. I think a bunch of change ongoing right now, but I'm particularly excited about the emergence of a few really compelling leaders in different aspects of education provision in the 5 years ahead.
Excellent. Very, very comprehensive. Thank you so much for giving us that information. Really interesting when it comes to looking at finance and where DFIs are allocating their capital. Really great insight there. To you, Matina, interested to also hear your insights here.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be there. So what I can say is that we have been operating in Madagascar and Africa for 4 years now. And what I can tell to you is that at that time, there were not many tech bootcamps or almost no tech bootcamps. And since our arrival on the market, tech bootcamp and digital training are multiplying in Madagascar and also in other countries we see. I don't think I'm an expert in education in general, but from what I've seen on the education market, especially in terms of higher education in IT or other fields, it's clear that the digital has taken a significant importance, not only because COVID-19, but also I think that the digital is currently really underused, in my opinion. Because what we say is digital is not only for developers and geeks, it is for all professions to become more efficient and focus on tasks with higher added value. I think that digital and internet revolutions allow this. Indeed, a recent study conducted by Daniel Susskind, which is an Oxford and King's College lecturer, explained the rise of microtasking and microworking challenges. And his studies shows that technology is not destroying or creating jobs, but that technology will conduct workers to other tasks that are more useful and tasks that are more valuable than some that they used to do before and that now are done by robots. So with this in mind, I think that in the next 5 to 10 years, the real issue and challenge we're gonna have is to really reconnect learning to employability in a very precise way through new technologies. And this, I think, will depend on our ability as a society to make the right choices about our work model. So the question is, do we want to continue to favor the most privileged? Do we want to continue with the full-time work model? Or are we ready to move to a model where work is accessible to all? Are we ready to move to a model where we work less, but more efficiently, creating more added value? And I think that it is important to know that this is possible thanks to innovation and technology around microtasking and crowdsourcing. And this is something what we do on a daily basis in Sayna. This is something we try to to revolution and to implement in a different area, especially in the tech space.
Excellent. Really great insights, just talking about employability skills and discussing microtasking and sort of the digital landscape. And I love how right now we have, you know, the Honorable Minister talking about the competency-based curriculum from a government perspective and what needs to happen there. And Chinezi really discussing much more around things around capital and the building of, let's say, African champions in the education sector. And your point really of what do you then do when you have this talent and bringing it into the African workforce. So thank you so much for tying that all together, everyone, by giving your insights. So the next question I'm going to ask is really going to be focused on K through 12. I think that's a huge space where we see a lot of young people on the African continent. And we have here a minister and we also have a private sector player. And what my question is here is looking at the K through 12 education space, which is typically primary school through to secondary school in Africa, who is making the greatest advancements in this space? And importantly, what are they doing radically different? And maybe we can start with you, Chinezi, then head over to the Honorable Minister.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge space. So you've got to sort of structure it a little bit. You've got some real public innovations, I think, and some real private sector innovations as well. And then across that, you've got them at different sort of price points. So you could sort of think about it almost like you've thought about a 2x2 in a way where you've got, public, private, and then you've got low fee all the way to high fee to create different levels of accessibility. And then you've got around that core, you've got a bunch of ancillary areas around teacher development and training, financing, tech enablement, and so on. And I think there's, the good news for anyone here who is a problem solver, innovator, creator, there is tremendous opportunity to solve and contribute in all of those spaces, public, private, and otherwise. So I'm very excited about innovations like Tusome, which is one that's well known in East Africa around really taking effective literacy and numeracy learning to scale through as a public sector and owned by government. And really, what's innovative about it beyond just the systems and the instructional practices is the ownership. The way sort of what started as a program has become sort of the mainstream of teaching of instruction across a very large public system. That's really fantastic, really exciting. So anyone who's trying to partner or serve in public systems that's exciting. The curriculum changes the minister just mentioned, similar other curriculum changes to try to say, how do we not just do shifts in policy, but actually develop the teaching capacity to enable that really big challenging problem. If you can do it really well, fantastic. That's the particular core of things like competency-based curricula. On the other side, on the private side, I'm really excited by some of the innovations, particularly low fee. I mentioned the Imagine Worldwide. I'm very excited about the idea that, and really three problems I hope we can solve. Two of them are K-12. One is much more access to real learning. And that's an affordability and an access challenge, even if it's tech and that has to work offline. So how do you get many more of the future 1 billion young people you mentioned with just basic access to the world, because they can read, they enumerate, they can articulate ideas, they can engage. That is the problem that's a lot about solving price point and accessibility. And I think that folks like Imagine Worldwide, who I think are doing really interesting, like world-leading work in it. The other is then leadership and excellence. I think Africa has too few institutions, beacons of excellence that really create folks who then can, you may have some social capital, you may have some wealth, but you like to have the kind of preparation that makes you a shaper of the world, because half the world's young people will come from here. The world needs African shapers, and so those kind of innovations, and that's an area I think we try to fall into, which is make that kind of learning really accessible. And I'm really excited about the kind of things we and others in this space are doing. And then lastly, I think where there's some things in teacher development and so training which are really interesting. That I think there's more to be done there. The area where maybe we'll get to an opportunity to talk about it more, but the area where I think there is white space in K-12, but also in tertiary, that is not getting adequate solving is the financing, not from the investor side, but financing the demand, financing the students, creating access to instruments and solutions where you can get real leverage from capital that's willing to take risk. To amplify the capital that's not willing to take risk in a way to sort of create much more lending or other insurance type instruments to support access. And I think that's a place where there's not enough happening. And if I were not doing what I'm doing, I would be encouraging someone, myself or someone else, to really be innovating and building enterprises in that space.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And I really enjoy how we're giving opportunities to the participants on this call to really also step up and go and solve some of these problems that we have on the continent. Over to you, Honorable Minister, on your thoughts as well.
I thought Chinezi was going to say, if I was minister, or if there's a minister here, if I had a chance to talk to a minister, I'll tell them to do this. So I was like, okay, I'm listening. But I mean, I do agree with what he's saying. For me, I also serve as Chief Innovation Officer. So, and then I was CIO before I became minister, and a lot of the principles around the work that we do at the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, I have embedded in the education sector. And for a while, when I was CIO, it was difficult to convince other sector heads to implement and to innovate. And these days I focused a lot on education because it's easy to convince myself. So a lot of the work that we're doing has been driving innovation and creativity and technology in education. And one of the principles of our national innovation and digital strategy is to focus on hybrid technologies, things that work online and offline, things that work on mobile. We also have mobile first, so mobile web, think about energy, think about connectivity. And I think the reason why it's important, I mean, to get a step back from your question to think about hybrid is we begin to address who. Then we can think about and why. Why are we innovating? Why are we creating these enterprises? If it's for learning, fundamental learning, so even if it's for teaching, quality teaching and learning, and who, we have to make sure that these solutions are hybrid such that they are inclusive. And when they are inclusive, then we're thinking about things as simple as paper. I like been saying these days, paper itself is technology. You know, on my table is stuff that will be distributed this weekend. It's the supplementary study pack for underperforming schools. And it's simple, but it is really fundamental to how we transform education in those communities. It's paper technology that will be put into old technological automobiles and will be transported into those communities that are far hard to reach, and the kids will get it. But then they do have access to mobile-based technologies around that dictionary that they can check using SMS and ESSB. They do listen to the radio teaching program that are there. So then it becomes a question of what are we innovating as well, the content and the programs. We need to think outside the box beyond the technology. If technology is just a medium, then it's what are the contents and what are the programs that we are developing for who and for what purpose? I think that's really the question that we try to answer.
Excellent. Thank you, Honorable Minister. And just to summarize before I go to the next question, I guess what I sensed from the responses we got regarding the question about, you know, who's doing great advancements, it was sort of looking at opportunities and how do we deliver global learning. I heard themes around inclusivity, having hybrid models that are not so strongly technology-based, but also trying to have sort of offline-based solutions. And also a little bit around financing, right? How do you meet the demand and enable people to actually get access to the services and the money that's required? So I would now like to go to you, Matina, and sort of now we've talked about K through 12 and going back to the earlier conversation, well, now what, right? And this is the very important question, which is sort of in your organization, how are you tackling the education to employment and the education to employment creation pipeline on the continent, right? Because we're going to have this large working age population. It's going to need to be employed, right? And it's also going to need to create some form of employment. So how are you looking at that within your organization?
Yes, I'd like to say, Taku, at the beginning, our mission at Sayna is to make tech learning and work accessible to all, regardless of social background or reason. And our vision is to train and put to work millions of people in Africa. So to do this, Sayna develops a mobile video game that automatically connects its learner to remunerative IT microtasks requested by companies, thanks to our algorithm. So in few figures, Sayna has trained in training actually more than 450 students. We have 90% of insertion rates. We work with more than 60 companies, And the microtaskers on our platform can earn between 100 euro to 1,000 euro per month, depending on if you want to do more tasks or not. And to grow and reach more people, at Sayna we have an obsession. So how to build a unique learning experience for our learners to be ready to integrate our Sayna work platform as soon as they're ready. So we decided with our team to set up a system to do education beyond school for real, because we think that learning should be continuous and diffused through digital, not only in class. So our system combines both the mechanism and the most basic principles of video games and a game in general, while we rely on cognitive and behavioral psychology with our experts to propose the best learning methods. So indeed, we were inspired by certain Oxford methodologies. So I'll give you one example of a methodology called the active recall. So indeed, we have made a variant of Oxford active recall methodology adapted to Africa. So for example, when Mario, a learner, has finished learning his lesson, to revisit, he can go to the Sayna mobile video game to challenge one or more of his friends in a space battle, where each of his actions in the battle to win is conditioned to respond positively to a series of several quizzes. So we go even further, so he can use weapons that he has collected during his training to fight his opponent in the game. So the victory is thus conditioned to the fact that the learner has well seen his courses previously. So to sum up, the goal is to play so that you learn, but not to learn and then play. So we inverse the way of thinking and the way of training. So the idea is to set up a real learning process and not just cramming, which has no sense today. So I have spoken to you about the virtual, but we consider at Sayna that the face-to-face meeting is so important. So we need that all learners must meet and interact together. So we decided to deploy via co-working spaces and cybercafe around Africa some programs where learners can meet and to do activities together. So we have, for example, thematic webinars every week that they can watch together. They have project and exercise correction for webinars to watch together. And we also have office hours organized by and for our learners several times a week. So today we have a total nearly 8 types of activities or content types, because the minister talked about the importance of the contents. And so we have different types of content, and each type of content has its own objective. Because in fact, our experience with more than 450 learners has allowed us to understand that there is no one way to learn. And the way to assimilate skills for each learner is completely unique and completely different to another learners. So I think that's what I can say about this question, Taku.
Thank you very much. And I really enjoyed how you have this hybrid model already in mind in solving the education to employment / employment creation pipeline. I would like to sort of pose that same question to you, Chinezi, because you're the feeder of this talent that's going into the workforce. How do you view what the next steps should look like for this young talent? And do you have any successes so far with some of the learners that have come through your institutions?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that in 2 ways. The first is what do we do, and then second, I actually want to again throw out an opportunity to the folks who are in this session. So the first, what do? We call ourselves schools for innovators and leaders. So we're essentially trying to develop a set of competencies and capabilities that enable young people to be shapers, part of which is in whatever environment. So so we have a number of programs that support that. Example is a post-school success program. So we're not just sort of getting ready for the transition exams, which are important, and we certainly want to build that mastery. But we have a program that's pretty unique in the space, a self-developed program to support planning, preparation, and readiness for whether it's work or study beyond secondary school. That's really important to create sort of success in the next phase. And we see we've had just 3 years of graduates so far. So we are about 9 years old, so 3 years of graduates. We see them. We've got folks who are in jobs and who've started businesses, who are in university, and we see the real impact on their success of having had that holistic capability building that certainly is academically rigorous, but complements with a set of character and sort of productivity skills that I think will really support them to thrive. So I'm pretty, we will know in 10 years to see the degree of success in the work, success in creating jobs, success in innovation that our students have. But so far, early sort of touch points with alumni is pretty reassuring that we're able to, through the academic and hallmark programs that we have, we're able to support folks for it. And happy to share that with anybody who is interested in those programs. That's the Nova Pioneers orientation and approach and early evidence, right? However, I'll say, I think you framed this whole session with the data around the youth bulge, right? And I think there is a tremendous, Matina, you're leading a company that's solving this area. But trying to identify, there's a tremendous opportunity here to say, there are only two regions in the world that have a growing young population, Africa and Asia, right? And Africa much faster. And we are now more connected in our ability to serve markets that are not just domestic, right? Through tech, through skills and services. So there's this opening and huge opportunity, I think, for someone who wants to be a problem solver, entrepreneur, public servant, what have you, to say, how do we then serve the world, the global markets, with the talents, the young people who are going to be the bulk of the world's young people. This is where the skills and labor is going to come from. And we have a different kind of, what are the jobs where that makes sense? Is it teaching? Is it tech and coding? What are the jobs where we actually can make that connection? And how do we facilitate the sort of training and the market making? And there's business in there, there's policy in there, there's opportunity there. And so that problem that you framed up in the beginning, or that situation, is a fundamental shift in dynamic in the world. And you've got this sort of comfort with distance work, with part-time work, with job, discrete work, with learning and working. You've got a shift in how work is happening, learning is happening. And there's a mega global human capital company to be built there, And so I didn't want to miss the opportunity to make a plug to encourage folks to really think about innovating that space.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And this really speaks again to the need. I mean, one part, and I'm going to hand this over to the Honorable Minister, is just looking from a government perspective. We sort of heard some of the private sector solutions to really creating this education to employment and employment creation highway. From where you sit, what have you seen to work currently, right? Because we just mentioned there's this huge bulge of talent and we have to capture and harness it. What have you seen to have worked so far from your experience?
I think policy is lagging behind the reality, and it just is sadly how governance happens. The innovators, the crazy ones, the entrepreneurs, the people who are having all these good ideas are ahead of where policy is, and thus the policy doesn't. I deal with this myself, so it's not about an outsider. I have to convince my colleagues about certain things. The policy is built to address issues that we see. Policies are backward-looking generally and to guide certain things. They are not forward-looking and inviting, right? And so, and some of the things we're doing differently is you establish sandboxes, right? So there's a sandbox in financial inclusion where you get young people to come in, test and do stuff where you've not built regulations for that. There's a sandbox in teacher solutions. So within the education sector, we have sandboxes. But I think, and you don't really necessarily have a sandbox for, you could, but you don't have a sandbox for job creation. I think it's a difficult proposition, and just say we need as many entrepreneurs to keep pushing governments to ask those questions and to solving those problems, and ultimately government will have to catch up to them. And I think the real comment here is to not wait for government policy before we can implement, because that comes after you will have disrupted the industry. But I think one of the areas that I've seen the Minister of Youth, for example, in Sierra Leone, do very well is he's building these youth connect centers and he's promoting youth entrepreneurship intentionally. So he's also through the National Youth Service focusing young people to do these skills that will be technical. I know in the Ministry of Technical and Higher Education, they're expanding a lot on the government technical institutes. So not just having degree programs in universities, those are great, but how do you come up with new courses where people are learning specific skills? It's not micro skills, but like 1 year, 1.5 year level of training that can help you to deliver. We need hybrid of all of these things. We need the people who are training, who are getting young people to get micro skills and getting really focused on specific tasks. We need a technical and higher institutions to create a framework for technical institutes and having hands-on skills that people get. And I think in the private sector, we need the entrepreneurs to disrupt, and we will catch up in government. It's interesting that I, in this particular debate, put myself on the government side as opposed to the but hey.
Understood. Thank you there, Honorable Minister. So it sounds like policy is lagging behind in responding to this, huge shift, or let's say growth in young people. And if policy does not keep up, then we may potentially not be able to harness this potential. So government, I guess, and private sector need to somehow, better work together to see eye to eye. My next question, and by the way, just to let everyone know on the call, please send in any questions you may have through the chat feature, and I will be sure to deliver your questions to our panel. So then the next question I have is, right now we have a global audience, some that are here in Oxford, others that are in North America, Asia, and the like, right? And you have all seen what has worked on the continent and what hasn't worked on the continent, particularly looking at those that might be coming in from the outside in. So my question is, in that perspective, what are some of the potholes that you would recommend the people on this call should avoid when implementing solutions in the education sector in Africa? And maybe here we can start with you, Chinezi, and then head over to the Honorable Minister and then Matina.
It's a good question that I may have only a partial answer to now, and we may have more reflections afterwards. There are a couple. One would be, I honestly, one thing I'd encourage folks who are keen to make a difference in space is not to be overly ideological, but a bit more pragmatic and listen to context and solve in context. What I mean by that is, to your point of DFI funding, there's so much debate around either public or private solutions. Honestly, families need solutions. So how do we, stretch models, work across models? I have spent part of my career working and supporting and servicing and supporting public services, and part of my career in a for-profit, for-purpose entity. That's one. Two, if you're externally investing in this space, I think there's too often heightened perceived risk or Africa discounts for folks investing, and you see this scale of capital that flows into other markets, and it's out of proportion. An entrepreneur may work really hard to get an early investment of $200,000 in this context, and the same amount of effort might get you $20 million in a very different context, and the size of the prize is not that different. It is different, but not that order of magnitude. Then the last thing, I guess, is just local execution. It's really just, I think I would not open a school in a country or for example, just our work, where it wasn't being led with a team on ground who understood that context, who had worked in that context, who had a sense of leadership in that context. I think it's just too much is missed and too much is assumed. So I certainly think there's tons of value in global expertise, in global best practice. I think we get a lot of value from that, absolutely. But that's got to be blended with real local knowledge and local leadership and local understanding of culture, context. And I would absolutely, anyone who's thinking about business, they say, how do you team up those two things? how do you team up like global best practice, and do not be apologetic about bringing global best practice. Do not be apologetic about learning, copying, and adapting. And make sure you've got the real local implementer, local wisdom, local relationship to support you in doing it in a way that is responsive to your local market, so a local context. So that would be probably the executional advice I would have. But keen to hear others.
Over to you, Honorable Minister.
Look, it's not. I have one of my mentors would say, you know, we should all reinvent the wheel, because his point was you learn from reinventing the wheel. And so as we do things, but it's not because maybe you come up with a really, really good different wheel, but we know that the wheel is not going to change much, really. But you're learning in that process. But when it comes to matters of livelihood and matters that affect children's learning outcomes and teachers and the context, then maybe we should reinvent the wheel in the computer model and the simulation as opposed to people's lives, right? So I think the reason why I'm mentioning this is we should separate our learning experience and why we do stuff from people's lives. And if we can create safe spaces to learn through the process, fine. But it shouldn't lead to giving people hope, and that cannot be translated into some permanence, and because it makes future work more difficult. People become more distrusting of these things. So that's one. The second part is, you know, when I was in school, I did the Innovate Salon project and Innovate Kenya and other things when I was in grad school. You're in grad school, you come, and interestingly, you know, I came to this ministry where I'm sitting now, and one of the directors that I'd met, I asked him to give me a business card, and he did. He wrote nice things like, please listen to David Sengeh. And I went to those schools all over the country, and they listened to me. And so I showed him the postcard the other day, and it's great that he listened to me, some 20-something-year-old grad kid who's saying, I want to go to all of these schools and tell them to do innovation, and gave me a note that I carried that allowed me to do it. And, you know, now he's my employee, and he's driving this stuff, and the youth innovation work is still going. And now I have full mandates, you know, to implement things across the country. So if some young person comes to me and says, hey, I have an idea, I probably will be like, sure, take this card and go around and do it in a safe way. And so I don't think we necessarily need to know fully an answer. And the reason why I was also mentioning that was when you're in grad school, you have ideas. I don't know, you get some grants from Oxford or wherever, $10,000 to go to a project. It's really just going to be some kind of pilot, some learning experience. It's not going to lead to something that will transform somebody's lives immediately. It could many years later if you continue. And you don't have the money and you stop doing it later on because you have an internship to go and do and all of that, and that's fine. But then I left that. I was feeling a little bit frustrated in grad school. I was like, okay, fine. I have all these ideas and I can implement something and you get some money here and there, but I'm not getting really major change, you know? So I went to IBM and I was in IBM research. And there you have a little bit more money, you know, you can get $1 million to do some projects and you work with governments. And you go to those governments and then the government and you implement them, but the governments don't have the resources to take them on, you know, then you get frustrated because you're like, oh, you're developing all these projects, but these government people, you know, they are not really, they're not taking this. And then I joined government and I was like, finally, you know, I can now implement things at scale. And then you go to the private sector and nobody trusts government. Everybody's like, government is too slow and bureaucratic. And so you never win. You know, it's one of those where we just have to make things work. And you can drive impact when you're in college or high school or wherever, as long as you understand the vision and you're working with the right people. You can do it in private sector, but your impacts can be limited. And in government, some of us are waiting for the Matinas and the Chinezis and those people to come and be like, okay, I want to do this. Let's do this. There are not many who trust government, and for justified reasons as well. So the advice really is we need to have more conversations, understand each other, and let's not implement the will where people's lives is on it, but we can create safe spaces to learn and build and test ideas that can ultimately make a school principal 10 years later who's doing really well for your work.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And then I'll head over to you, Matina, and then after you, we will then start heading over to questions from the audience.
Yes, I think that with the experience we had on the ground, we've learned three things about the portals we need to avoid when we want to implement education solutions in Africa. So the first lesson has been you can't apply an occidental model without adapting it to Africa. And Chinese talk about that, and I think it's something really, really important. We tried French system model, we tried America system model, and it didn't work. So the first lesson. Then the second lesson, I think, is not using digital is something we did, and I think it was a mistake, a huge mistake, but we learned. But also at the same time, when it's in terms of K-12 ages, I think that we need to keep this mindset of no screens. I think that we can learn, we can teach tech skills without a screen, and there is plenty way to do it, and we do it with different organizations, and we have partners that are developing some robots for children, they're developing a different methodology through gaming, and I think this is really important is to preserve the children. And then I think the third lesson we learned, it's we need to ask questions. We need to ask questions to our students, and not asking questions is a really big mistake. But at the same time, not asking the right questions at the good moments is also a mistake. And I think that we need to give us some time as an organization, as a company, to ask the good questions to students and asking ourselves the good questions. So yes, I think that's my point about the last question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the response. And just to summarize, for those in the audience who are interested to go and solve problems and access some of the opportunities on the continent, our panelists have basically said the first thing you want to do probably is to listen, ask questions of the constituents you're going to be working with. Don't try and reinvent the wheel too much, right? Try and use what's there and from wherever you may be or what's there locally, and try to customize it. Potentially, maybe also ensure you have local partners on the ground so that you can understand the climate, and also try and potentially involve government earlier rather than later. And we heard, the story from the Honorable Minister who started from graduate school and then really ended up in government, to see that it's actually a journey and it takes time. And he is actually looking for private sector players that would like to come and solve these problems that government has. So there's still a huge opportunity for you to go and address. So over to the questions that we have in the chat. Thank you very much for your questions, everyone. Let's start off with the question from Shaheen. Shaheen asks, what are the possibilities for African countries to conceptualize modern education models and systems that cherish local socio-cultural distinctiveness without falling in the trap of mere importation of foreign models that hardly coexist internally? Maybe I could give that question over to you, Chinezi.
Sure, and I think if you're close to the families and kids for whom you're trying to create opportunity and you're problem solving from there, I think then I am pretty agnostic about where I get the solution from. I think it's important to involve local problem solvers, educators, folks in the problem solving, because I think you'll bring in some of their wisdom and skills automatically, and sort of that way. But I'm pretty I'm pretty non-ideological about this. I want young people to succeed and thrive and flourish, and I think I'm willing to borrow that wisdom from anywhere. I do think you are less likely to be successful and to serve the well-being of the child if you don't have that local wisdom on the team that's problem solving. I think you're more at risk to not actually. I do think Africans will value an African child often more through affinity, in a way that if I don't have an African on my team, I may not see. I think there are some dynamics that are difficult, and I would say this carefully because I have co-founded Nova Pioneer with non-Africans who value our students incredibly much, and so that's not characteristic, but I think it is important to have some African leadership in your organization, because I think it informs your vision for your children and informs your understanding of the context. Thereafter, I will draw solutions from anywhere that I think will support our children to thrive. And I'm not particularly ideological about, I want to be concrete about the question. If there are things in that question I'm missing that have a concrete, tangible proposal, all ears around it. But at a level of principle, sure, I'd rather solve the practical path a child has to thriving and accessing the world.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, you want to add something there, Matina?
Yes, I think that what Chinezi said is really important. And moreover, I could go further to say that I think that we need to rely on the people that are African, that have been living abroad in America, in Europe, and in Asia. And because those persons have the local culture in Africa, they've been raised there, they understand the issue, they understand the challenges. And at the same time, they see what works abroad. And so I think that those are the people that have the capacity to really making a mix of those things. And we need really to rely on them and to work with them and to give them spaces. And at the same time, we need that the government in generally listen to these people, because I think that they are the ones that have the capacity to build this educational system in Africa with innovation, and at the same time the local culture and the local economics issue. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that response. And I'm going to go to the next question, which is very interesting, sort of a merge of two questions that we have here on the chat. And we've talked a lot about formal education. I think Chinezi mentioned it earlier on as well, that there are different ways of learning, right? You don't necessarily have to be in the confines of a classroom. So really the question here is from the perspective lens of formal education, how do we value and ensure there's accessibility to provide informal education to people that are not in the formal educational system? I could reshape the question one more time, or was that clear in terms of the question, just to check?
No, it's clear, and I'm gonna take it, guys, because I think the question is so important, because what I said before is that the process of learning has changed, and today we just didn't learn in a school. We learned at home. We learned on the bus through the audio podcast. We learn when we speak to an expert. There is different ways to learn, and the challenge is to recognize that type of learning. And the challenge is to use this type of learning to implement it into the formal learning, so that they can be recognized and in the global in the global education space. And I think that is a question that is related to this is about how we do that, how we are doing when we have people that didn't have access to formal education, so they didn't have access to job. And I think that our challenge and the mission is to make sure that people that didn't have access to formal education can have access to informal education. And by means of this informal education that is recognized in the job market, that's so they can have access to the job. And this is the things we are doing with the microtasking, because for a microtasking system, we have students today that didn't have any baccalaureate, they didn't have a degree on IT, but they can start to work on micro tasks because the task was really defined and constrained on something small that they can do, and so they can progress. And I think with this person who didn't have a formal education background, we need to go with them step by step and accompany them slowly but surely.
Excellent. And I know we have about 4 minutes left, so it'd be great to also get your thoughts there, Honorable Minister, from a government perspective. What needs to be done in terms of provisioning informal education, considering government always has policies and puts regulations in place?
Regulations and policies are not bad. Look, I also serve as the chair of the UNESCO Global Education Monitor, or the Global Education Monitoring Report to UNESCO. And this year's theme is on the role of non-state actors in education. I believe we need non-state actors in education. And as Matina said, learning is happening everywhere. And but that does not mean it should not be regulated. And in fact, we do speak a lot about the kinds of regulations and how those policies need to be in place. But as I'd mentioned, that we don't have a homeschooling policy in Sierra Leone, but it's wrong to homeschool. We homeschool anyway. We were home learning most of the time, right? Is where kids are learning with no policy. So it's a question of, but we also know that we have lots of out of school children, 350,000. Well, if their parents are not going to say we're homeschooling them, that's why they're out of school. That's not, it's different. So you need policies to make sure people send their children to school. And it's a different set of contexts. And to the earlier question about Western, I think often the lazy part of problem solving is to say, oh, it's Western, it's not traditional. And I think as Chinezi said, a good idea is a good idea, irrespective of where it comes from. And it's about understanding the principles behind what we're doing and contextualizing it.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much for that response. And I really also wanted to hear Chinezi's perspective, but we don't have sufficient time. Unfortunately, we're really coming to the very end of our session today. But again, I think just wrapping up in terms of the aims we wanted to cover, I think there were a lot of interesting insights we got from the existing education system models that are in Africa, some of the interesting innovations and solutions, and some of the big opportunities that all of us on this call can go and pursue within the private sector, and also potentially collaborate with government. So with that being said, I would like to say thank you very much to all our panelists for joining us, and thank you as well to our audience for asking really inquisitive and insightful questions. I wish you all a wonderful day and take care. Bye-bye.